Most blokes, particularly farmers, I think look after their tractors more than they look after their own bodies. You know, they won't miss the service, that 1,000-hour service, because they understand if they do, that machine might let them down when they most critically need it. And then the analogy's just so clear. You know, the ultimate machine is the one that we walk around in, and you have to look after it. You have to check in.
Welcome to Healthy Minds, Healthy Vines, the wellbeing podcast for growers, proudly brought to you by the Wine Grape Council of South Australia, sponsored by Perza, hosted by
journalist and award-winning mental health podcaster Callum McPherson,
and columnist for The Australian and the World of Fine Wine and Australia's leading wine writer when sold by the kilo, Nick Ryan. Let's crush this. Today we're joined by Ash Keegan. Ash wears more hats than most, including his role as CEO of Food and Beverage Australia Limited, better known as FABAL. For this chat, we've asked him to wear his grape grower hat, which every grape grower should actually have, and tap into his insight as the chair of the Viticulture Committee of Australian Grape and Wine. Australian Grape and Wine is the national body representing grape growers and winemakers. Head to the show notes for more links and all the details.
Ash, you were a chiropractor before you started in viticulture. How'd you go from one to the other?
Yeah, well, Callum, I accidentally ended up in the wine industry, really.
Don't we all?
Yeah, well, it was pretty much. I met my wife in Kalgoorlie, and we moved down to Margaret River. I was going to set up a practice down there, and her father just bought a vineyard. And unfortunately, he got crook and got diagnosed with cancer and needed a hand to look after his vineyard. So I sort of sat there and looked out the window and said, I assume the vines are those things in a row out there. So that was my start to the industry, and what I expected to be a few weeks was sort of turned into 25 years, and I fell in love with doing what we do and still do it today. So
would have had a fair bit to learn on the fly there.
Yeah, it was good. Like I think one of the things our industry does really well, like literally people knew what was going on, and you know, the next door neighbour would show up and show me how to tie a wire knot, or you know, one of my best mates, Steve James from Voyager Estate at the time, was one of our customers. So he showed up, and you know, sort of he was my viticultural go-to guy. But probably one of the things that I learnt through chiropractic was you learn to learn. And I remember walking into the office and there was a stack of about 5 years worth of Grape Grower magazines, and I started on the top one and read and went to the next time. Yeah. And it was pretty much, I think I had my first mobile at that stage, so there was no Google at that point to learn. So, but the industry's great. Like I remember sort of reading articles going, Dr. Mike McCarthy, he knows a fair bit about irrigation. So I'll just ring him up and ask him about, you know, how do I irrigate a vine? And straight on the other end of the phone, probably one of the smartest irrigators on the planet, was on the other end of the phone to this guy who knew nothing, sort of helped me through those decisions. So, and pretty much most decisions that I made in the early days were a bit like that. It was about finding someone to help me with that decision. And as I said, you know, the industry does a great job in that context. You're only a phone call away from someone who can help you out.
Tapping into a hive mind. Really, it's the way it works. But
yeah, it is. Good description.
Was there a moment, you know, that you saw yourself fall over the edge and go, that's it, I'm viticulture now, and, you know, cracking backs be gone?
I was still doing locums, you know, for the first couple of years, and I sort of probably got to a point where I actually just, not accidentally, I enrolled myself in the Charles Sturt degree just because I wanted to learn a few things, and you could just buy subjects at that point. And Charles Sturt rang up about 6 months or about 9 months in and said I'd knocked off, you know, X amount of subjects. Do I actually want to enrol? And I thought, at that point I made a decision that I'd enrol and keep going. But probably about 2 years in, I reckon I thought, you know, I really love it's going to sound silly, but the things that I liked about viticulture were very similar to some of the things I liked about being a chiropractor. I was still diagnosing stuff. Instead of using an X-ray machine, I'd use a soil sample or a PDL test, and so those sort of intellectual challenges were still there, and I got to chase them down a lot. But I literally loved being outside. I'd grown up in the suburbs of Melbourne, so I hadn't done the farm thing. I literally fell in love with doing that. So unfortunately, I don't get to do that much anymore these days, but that's what sort of flicked the switch for me, I think.
Yeah.
Do you ever miss cracking backs?
No, look, I I don't. My brother's still a chiropractor. I've still got great mates that are doing that. I sometimes think about again, it's probably that intellectual challenge. I love the one-on-one with patients. I love helping people in that context. But, now I guess particularly as I've grown through my career and I'm sort of in more leadership roles, that I still get to help people. I still get to impact on stuff, and some of the things we talk about today I get to influence. And maybe I end up putting my hands on people, but I still influence people's health and stuff at a day-to-day level as well. So, yeah.
And you do cover a fair bit of ground, and that would take quite a bit of energy, I imagine. How's health and fitness factored into your life?
My wife can't hear me at this stage, so that's, no. Look, I think it's something that obviously with the background knowledge, I'm conscious of that. I'd like to do more exercise like most guys would, but I still, I'm conscious of the way I look after myself at a day-to-day level. I think one of the things we should talk about today is, making sure you're fronting up to your GP and checking in. Now, I've clocked over 50 now, and that's an important age. Each of us needs to be checking in. I do that regularly, and that's a pretty important component of it. And
when you say regularly, how regularly?
Yeah, it's good. I got a really great GP, which I think is pretty important to have, Nick. I get the pathology slip in the mail each 12 months that says go and get these blood tests, and I'll see you in a week. And that's for the standard men's stuff. Yeah. And but then I'll go as required. Yeah. And
and we're probably talking to a lot of people who would never miss a service on the ute or on a harvester or something else, but might miss a service on themselves.
Oh, I've said that many times. I think most blokes, particularly farmers, I think look after their tractors more than they look after their own bodies. They won't miss a service, that 1,000-hour service, because they understand if they do, that machine might let them down when they most critically need it. And then the analogy's just so clear. The ultimate machine is the one that we walk around in, and you have to look after it. You have to check in and make sure that's getting serviced as well.
Why do you think growers are reluctant to go?
I think if we knew the answer to that question, we'd be doing this interview on our yacht in Mallorca, I think, because...
mine's being serviced.
Yeah, well, that's right. I think a few things. I think we delude ourselves in the fact that we get busy and we don't have time for some of that stuff, and that, there's always something to do on the farm. There's always something to do in any business, in an organisation. And I think sometimes, if you're completely frank, sometimes there's a bit of fear associated with that as well. I don't want to know about
stuff bury your head
that's
in the
bad.
sand.
Yeah. You got the bucket of sand out, and that's probably, without trying to be too Freudian about it, I think that's probably some of the things that limit why people, and particularly guys, go to the doctor.
Yeah, and being busy can never be an excuse, because it's probably, if you are that busy, you need it. You really need it, and it's time to get checked. Yeah,
and I think, and we, busy people schedule themselves a lot, and it's just a matter of prioritising that, and it's making sure that you get that order right.
Would be easy to see it as an extra stress though, when you've been working all day, or you are particularly busy, or even if it's just your usual routine, to see that going to the doctor is an extra hassle. You're going to have to travel to go there or put in that extra effort. It makes sense how that can be your mindset. But I guess the thing with it is, if you don't look after it at the time, it's going to end up costing you down the road, and it's going to end up costing you more time. And so really staying on top of it as much as you can is going to avoid it getting to some point where you're going to have to take a significant amount of time off, or you're going to have to deal with something that's going to cost you a lot more perhaps than if you just have those regular checkups. Sort of like anything, prevention's the best cure for this sort of stuff, but a lot of the time we don't actually act until it's a real problem.
Yeah, I still remember sitting in a pathology lecture back in the day, and the pathology professor stood up and said, what's the first sign of a heart attack? People put their hands up and said, it's chest pain, it's jaw pain, or it's... what's the first sign of a heart attack in most of the situations? Well, the answer is simple, it's death. And so, it sort of struck me then, and it sticks with me, whatever it is, 30 years later, that often some of the things that can impact us pretty significantly don't have that sort of lead time. So you need to, if your cholesterol's high, you need to know about it. And so simple way to do that is just go and get your blood test and get it sorted out.
Yeah, and I suppose imagining that, it's not a problem for me today, therefore I'm not thinking about the future, it's not a great way to go about it. But anything that's not immediate, the temptation is, we can always do it tomorrow. There's always something more pressing to take care of before that. But if we always have that attitude, that's what leads to one day, out of nowhere, seemingly, disaster can strike. And really there was a build up to it. We just chose to ignore the signs. So.
Yeah, I think you raised a really good point, Callum. The other thing too is we learn more and more that, our genetic history is important as well. So if mum or dad or your brothers have had problems, like my dad's had an aggressive prostate cancer, that means by definition I'm statistically more likely to have that. And so therefore my brothers and I were, offered an earlier age to go and get the checks, and that's something that's really critically important for us, as a family. But it's no different to girls with family history of breast cancer and anybody with family history of bowel cancers and things like that as well. So, I guess
you had a run-in with skin cancer recently.
Yeah, I had malignant skin cancer removed from my neck 4 weeks ago. And again, it was a good example where, I've got a great GP, and I just front up to my GP and go, do you have a look at this? And he's going, I think it's okay, we'll freeze it off. We froze it off, and 3 weeks later or 2.5 weeks later, still there, back to my GP and go, no, I don't like the look of that. Let's get that cut off. And fortunately, that's all clean margin and all good, things like that. But it's just an example where it wasn't a big issue for me at the time, but it was quite rapidly became something that needed to come off pretty quickly.
I guess, that is, one of those sort of industry prevalent, issues as well, in viticulture. People spending a lot of time out in the vineyard, that's, something you have to be really mindful of.
Yeah, well, you're a bit like yourself, Nick. We know Bronze Dozzie's
exactly.
in the quintessential definition of it. Yeah,
we've got going.
So, it's certainly for me, I've always been really conscious about sunscreen. I've got a big bottle sitting in the car door, and if I'm off to the paddocks, that's the first thing I'll whack on. But, you can be as careful as you can be, but we're in Australia.
Yeah.
And I go surfing and I do art stuff, and so by definition, we're... And again, unfortunately, it's you tick over. You get a bit older, and age catches up with some of that stuff as well, and it's a risk factor.
It's something I did a couple of months ago, and will now do probably every year. For the rest of my life, is a full body sort of skin check, and there's various things all over this body that just need to be
too much information, mate.
Need to be watched and looked at closely.
Yeah.
But there are, and they do change, and you'd think something might be fine and not really an issue, but they can change.
You blokes are a bit older than me. How does
thanks for pointing it out.
Just a little bit. How does the attitude towards health and getting those checkups, and I suppose maybe the mindset about just looking after yourself, how have you noticed that change maybe since your 20s to now?
It's harder, Kel. I think it's, staying fit's harder. That's probably the thing that I find.
Yeah, I feel that too.
Nick can relate to that one.
Yeah. Like I still run around and play baseball with my mates on the weekend in a semi-organised fashion, but you feel it. You just feel, you don't have the same stamina that you used to. Even this weekend, up working on the farm myself, and you just can't go all day like you used to. And it's a matter of, from a background perspective, musculoskeletal injuries and things like that can increase as well. So if you're on the shovel, you're going to need to take a break and or do it properly, or you can't just shrug it off and run out of the footy field next week anyway. So.
Yeah, and there are a lot of people that think, I can still do what I used to do in my 20s, and they're the ones that will keep hurting themselves. They just push themselves. I guess it is a matter of knowing your own body and your own limitations and how you can get the best out of yourself.
Yeah, it is, I think, but also not to give up too. Like I honestly played my first string pitcher in my baseball team, 72 years of age, and is a screaming example.
It's a strong shoulder.
Yeah, it is, but it's a great example of it's as much here as it is anywhere else, and
it's a bit of use it or lose it.
Yeah, it is, and so I think that it's important. It's important in that context.
When we're talking about the pillars of health, we're thinking about diet, exercise, sleep. Do you think the grower lifestyle makes it harder to stay on top of all those things?
It depends on where in the grower stream. You know, if you're at home on the farm, I think, you know, it's just that extra lap that you want to do or that extra tank that you put out, and so timing often throws out the window. I certainly find it difficult because, you know, you do a lot of travel, whether that's the, you know, Tintinara Roadhouse doesn't have the most, I shouldn't say that. It's got some fantastic food, which is my choices at the Tintinara Roadhouse might be the problem rather than...
Yeah, but there's no, hey, I love a good steak sandwich, but there might be nutritionists out there who say, you know, you don't have one every day. And maybe, you know, get the smaller chips.
So I think timing's probably one thing. We touched on that earlier before. And then, you know, putting yourself in the situation where you got, you know, the right foods to eat as well, as opposed to the easy foods to eat or the quickest foods to eat is probably important.
I suppose when you got a lot to do, is you might easily sacrifice one of those pillars of health because you think, well, if I spend time doing that, then I'm not going to get what needs to be done, and that's my priority. But I can see how you fall into having that attitude every day and then really neglecting some part of your life that ends up biting you in the arse eventually. Do you think that attitude's fairly prevalent?
I think so. It comes back down to why we don't go to the doctor, because we're busy. Or why aren't we exercising more? Because we're busy. Or why aren't we taking the time to make ourselves a decent meal? Because we're perceived to be busy. And it really comes back down to, again, that prioritising of what's important, what's really important, as opposed to what we perceive to be important at that particular point in time.
Another part of that, I reckon, would be getting enough sleep, because growers will be getting up early and often going to bed late, you'd think, as well. And we know how crucial it is to get around that 8 hours of sleep. Do you think there's also a bit of a tendency to neglect sleep, or say, oh, I only need 4 hours, or it's better if I'm up at Sparrow's Fart? You think that's sort of the attitude too?
I think that's, and particularly one of the things that alarms me a little bit in the industry is there's a bit of bravado around it at harvest, and that's pretty dangerous.
If you're not sort of doing 20 hours in a day, you're not doing it properly, kind of thing.
And I read a study ages ago that it said if you've been awake for 17 hours, it's equivalent of driving at 0.05.
Yeah.
I never drink drive, and so I'm really conscious of when I'm hitting that 17 hour, and you know, I've slept in the back of the car at Canalpin because I've hit that 17 hours and it's enough. And
it's one of those things that you'd sort of shrug off and be like, oh no, it wouldn't be the same. But it's well proven.
I'll be right. I'll be fine. But so in our business, we set harvest schedules for 10 hours. The guys are allowed to go to 12 if they have a breakdown, but after 12 they shut it down, and it'll be there tomorrow.
It's the same as other jobs where it becomes illegal at a certain point to keep pushing staff to work.
Yeah, I think it's really, really critically important. And Nick touched on it. I think there's an industry sort of halo around that. But the only thing that really worries me, and you know, as CEO of our organisation, is that phone call where one of our team's been hurt. And
it's happened.
It happens all the time.
Too many stories of it happening.
Because your concentration goes to shit after not very long if you're not sleeping.
And look, and our guys, they're going hard during harvest. They're operating machinery. They're in, you know, high attentive, high focus. They might be sitting down and operating machinery, but it is mentally exhausting to do that. You get in your car to drive home.
To get home, and it's probably a decent distance to get home.
Correct, and exactly that. You know, some of them have got 30 and 40-minute drives home, and it's not that hard to envisage, you know, touch wood, someone nodding off in that situation and catastrophic outcomes. And so I think that's the way we try to engineer around that, and it make it okay just to shut it down, and it'll be there tomorrow. And yeah, it's important, and that fruit's important, but it'll be there tomorrow to get off the next shift.
And you have to be here tomorrow as well.
Yeah, do. And I think, like, you might say that's easier in a bigger company like ours where we're going on stop, and it might be harder for an individual farmer. But but it's probably even more critical with an individual farmer and that's his crop. If I put my grow hat on, sure, if crusher shuts down, I can tell you your fruit won't be picked and it'll sit there till tomorrow. So if your harvester breaks down, it's okay for it to sit there until tomorrow as well.
Another part of that sleep deficit, it doesn't mean if you're not sleeping so plenty of people might say, oh, well, I don't not sleep for 17 hours, so therefore I'm fine. But your sleep deficit actually builds up over time as well. So say you're supposed to be getting 8 hours a night, but you're getting 5 instead. And by the end of the week, you've got a deficit that's 17 hours and you're feeling those same effects.
Yep.
So even if you're thinking like, oh, I still sleep every night, it's not that bad, that does build up over time. And the most important part of that sleep cycle is between that sort of 6 to 8 hours in REM sleep when we're dreaming a lot. That's when your brain's actually recharging, rejuvenating. So if you're skipping that part every night, then the sleep you're getting is actually not all that revitalising, and it's going to end up having a big effect down the road, and you won't even really realise why you're feeling so tired or why you're feeling like you can't focus. But just missing a few hours night after night after night can end up having that effect.
Yeah, and particularly at like I said, an intensive period like harvest. And if it's a long drawn out, harvest, and you're 4, 5, 6 weeks into it, and just little bits every day are adding up.
I don't know about you guys, but I'm certainly, and my guys put their hand up and say they'll know when I'm heading into that deficit because I act differently. I make
more
different
irritable
decisions. And just ask my wife.
Yeah.
And but I think it's common for all of us in that context too. And it's those little bits of changes that over an extended harvest period add up to the point where, some of our harvests are 3 month long, and particularly if you're going flat out in the wineries, they can be all of that. And so,
can you do like a pre-season before vintage?
Hibernation, you mean?
Well, yeah. But, I mean, can you prepare yourself properly for these, intensive periods of a work year?
I think you become a bit game fit. You become a bit more self-aware, I reckon, Nick, too. You just even these things we're talking about, you sort of get to the point where, I think particularly as you get a bit more mature in your career and a bit more confident in your own skin, you go, hang on, I do need to take that day off and recharge, or I'm not going to go there and be there at 6 a.m. and that morning I'll get there in the afternoon. Just that self-awareness probably, I don't know, I think it's like all the things that we've talked about, general health needs to be in pretty good nick if you're going to put yourself under demand. But it's probably more being self-aware during the period to recharge.
And seeing some signs and knowing what they are. Interesting
what you say about that overall attitude where some growers might be thinking about what others might say about them or even if it's just in their head, but if they were to say, I make sure I get 8 hours sleep every night, and someone might be like, you're kidding yourself during harvest, like who does that? And so you're perhaps somewhat judging it off the fact like, I must not be working hard enough because there's this general attitude that you're supposed to run yourself into the ground, and if you don't, then you're not working hard enough.
We've had the opposite, Callum. I think again from a leadership point of view, an opportunity. I've had contractors show up and said, I haven't slept for 20 hours. Here's my badge. I'm saying, well, you're not working. If I've shut you down, you're not operating on my farm around my staff because that's
a risk.
Safe.
Yeah,
it's about changing that mindset as well. Really, it's about the standard that we walk past, the standard we accept, and it's really about understanding that. Yeah, it might be a great parcel of Shiraz, but it's not that important.
And how do you sell that to growers though? I imagine that what people want to do is be as effective as possible. So if you're trying to suggest a bit of an alternative lifestyle or making a real point of getting enough sleep, I think you've got to try to bundle that in with, because you end up having a better result. You actually, over the period of harvest or whenever it is, you actually end up doing a better job. You might not feel like you've worked as hard on a particular day because you weren't out there for 20 hours, but if you were able to stay consistent pretty much every day throughout and you didn't crash and burn halfway through, it's actually going to end up being better. It seems like we have to sell it in that way, because if it's a case of, you get enough sleep but you don't do as good a job, you don't get as much done, then realistically people probably aren't going to do it.
You're right, Callum, but in reality, with all due respect to us, we're picking grapes and making wine. We don't have a 12-year-old child on operating theatre and we're performing neurosurgery on their brain where time might be critical. We're picking grapes and making wine. And yeah, some of that has time elements to it, but it's not life or death. And so I think it's about getting some perspective around that and
being able to step back from that. But you might be able to convince yourself that it's the be all and end all because...
Yeah, but again, to me, it's up to the entire supply chain to do that as well. It's about the customer going, look, it's about working together from the paddock to the fermenters and beyond, that we all need to be conscious of that in the things that we ask each other to do. And, this year's a classic example, the last harvest where there was labour's up, costs are tight, and, several wine companies said, we're not taking fruit on, a Saturday because then we'll have to process on a Sunday and we're paying higher premium rates. Well, that tells you how important it is. It's about money.
When it affects the bottom line.
Yeah, but so really, if you're going to make that decision because of, a Sunday penalty rate, that should intrinsically tell all of us that it's not that life and death.
Yep.
That it'll be okay on the Monday or it'll be okay to do that on the day later, because, if collectively as an industry we're making those decisions, then it's okay for us as individuals to look after ourselves as well.
And partly, I suppose, people having such high expectations of themselves, which isn't a bad thing, but you've got to be able to treat yourself like a human being, let yourself off the hook to a certain extent when you're talking about a marathon, not a sprint type of a scenario.
Some of the challenges for us too comes when Mother Nature throws, the bricks at us as well. So
yeah, penalty rate's one thing, and something nasty on a bomb screen is another thing.
Yeah, and that's where I guess when we talked about match fitness or how do you prep, we'll have some contingencies in place if that happens, and it might be that you're working with your next door neighbour, or it might be that you're calling in the contractor, even though that hurts your bottom line a little bit, but you just got to weigh that decision up as to the risk reward out of that, and that invariably will happen as well. So it's it's something that having a plan B or a contingency in place helps you out there as well.
What things do you put in place to look after your staff's well-being?
So I run sort of 20 odd sites all over the country, and I sit in an office in Adelaide, so I can't be in every site, and I'm increasingly not there as often as I would like to be. So I think one of the things I really try to do is instill with my managers a very clear and simple sort of process that if they're in the paddock in the middle of the night and they're going to make a decision and they're not sure about that decision, they're not sure of the consequences of that decision, they can't get hold of someone to make them or help them with that decision, and they make it in this order, and it's people, product, profit. So people, never put yourself or anybody else in harm's way. Product, we put, it's a food grade product that we make and people put it in their mouth, so never ever compromise that. And if you do the first two in that order, then hopefully there's a bit of the third. But so I think probably trying to empower them with that mindset that it's okay. If in doubt, you chuck it on the ground, or if in doubt, you stop and you don't push for that 20 hours because you had to get it off, because it's not following the order. Because otherwise, we have SOPs and policies and procedures for everything, from scratching yourself to do all of that. But ultimately, it's good people making good decisions in tough environments. So you have to sort of empower them with a filter that says, these are our non-negotiables, and this is how you make the decision. If you make the decision in that order and it goes wrong, you'll have my 100% support. If you make the decision in a different order and it goes wrong, then we'll have a chat about it. So I think probably that's one of the core underpinning pillars of sort of how I try to look after our staff. And then there's a whole range of other stuff that, I sign off on every chemical that comes into our business. I read that from cover to cover. I read all the literature and the toxicology and everything on all of those things. And sometimes I choose more expensive products to put in our system.
Why are you so hot on the safe chemical handling?
I guess probably coming out of my background when I first entered the industry, one of my particular areas in private practice was, sort of neuropathology, things like MS and motor neuron, some of the neurological syndromes. And if you look at some of the insecticides that we use, anticholinesterase inhibitors, they actually act on insects the same way some of those pathologies manifest in humans as well. And that was quite alarming to me, to be frank, when I first sort of recognised the active ingredients. So there's a whole series of safety processes, things in place. But when I sort of look at those things, you know, I'm super hot on our staff wearing PPE, and you know, you get a warning, and then you got to go and find somewhere else to work if you're not prepared to wear PPE. But those products now, I engineer them out, or I accept risk. And I guess I'm lucky in our business now, in my role, as I get to make risk decisions, and I understand the fact that if we don't spray that, yeah, I'm assuming some risk, but in the context of I'm accepting that risk, or you know, it's $30 a hectare more to use product Y instead of product Z, and then I'm very comfortable with
not
that.
cutting any corners.
Yeah, and that's a decision, you know, you're making, you know, on a, you know, for your business. But you know, should we be firmer across the industry that those decisions, you know, for those people that will go, well, I will take the cheaper option because, you know, it's all about the dollar, and then, you know, that's elevating risk. Should we, you know, as an industry, take that temptation away?
No, look, the APVMA is the regulating body, so they, don't get me wrong, if they've got a registered product, they're some of the highest bars in the world.
Yep.
So they do a very good job of that. It still doesn't mean that I can't take a more
Raise the bar even more.
Yeah, a conservative approach. Well, we have a 48-hour entry period in any product in any one of our vineyards. If you read the label, as soon as it's dry, you can go back in. But again, I read some work years and years ago that Alex Ash presented was about the degradation pathway. So after a certain period, 50% of that product is degraded away. So it's a small window where we can make a decision to stay out of our paddocks, still get all the things done that we've done, but just the simple exposure curve then is dropped dramatically away. So it's just a small decision that we can make, that I can do the best that I can for my staff in that context.
So what can those insecticides do to people if they're exposed to them?
Oh, look, there's a range of different products, but the anticholinesterase products, which are old organophosphate insecticides, and many of them are getting banned now, but they work on a neuromuscular junction where the brain operates through a nerve, tells a muscle to fire, and that's how we move. The signal happens across a neuromuscular junction, and it's the chemical that makes that signal jump. That's the pathway that the insecticides inhibit and block. And
for insects, obviously, but
correct. But mammalian neuromuscular pathways are similar, so it can get into a situation where if you are accidentally or chronically exposed to those things, you can have neuromuscular symptoms. Very rare, but even in our business, I'd take blood tests of all new staff, and so I can have a look at their background levels, and to make sure that they haven't historically had issues on the farm. That if there was an accident on our property, I'd know whether it was a pre-existing or as a result of that accident. But again, that was far more prevalent 15, 20 years ago when we used to use a lot of that gear.
Do you think everyone's pretty wise to that now and generally using safe practices? Or
I think so. I think I still see a lot of stuff, go and do a lot of due diligence on other farms and things like that, and I still see practices there that, wouldn't exist under our steam. But and it's, again, probably, if there's a message out of this to the grower base, is, PP is cheap, it's simple, and we don't know what we don't know. We've all of us in our careers have used products that were fine, they were safe and no problems. Only 5 years later find out that there were some issues associated with that. So I take the approach that if I've make the best decisions that I can with the products that we come onto our farm, and I provide and get all of our guys wearing the best PPE, then I've done the best that I can, so that if in 20 years' time there's an issue, I've done the best that I can to protect my staff
better
today.
safe than sorry. What about Q fever? Have you had any dramas with that?
Yeah, so at least has obviously been talking to you about that. It's not a laughing matter. I mean, Q fever is a bacterial infection. It's what's called a zoonotic infection, which has come from an animal. And I recently received a phone call from Safe Work SA saying, Ash, you've got an improvement notice, which is not something that any business wants. And it's like, okay, what's happened? One of our staff had contracted Q fever, and they determined that the most likely route that staff member had contracted it was at work, because they hadn't had any other contact with animals. My personal opinion is I don't really mind where the staff member contracted that. It was most importantly he was in hospital and getting the right treatment, and fortunately he's healthy and well again. But just to sort of give you a bit of a chronology of it, so we use sheep in our vineyards in winter, like a lot of vineyards do, and sheep can carry Q fever, but the thinking behind the mechanism of infection was that sheep in our paddock from 12 months ago pooped on the ground that had dried, potentially created bacteria in the soil, formed dust, and then almost 12 months later that the staff member had picked up and inhaled the dust and potentially the bacterium.
Right.
So likelihood is pretty low, and it could have been some other casual interaction, but it made our business aware of it, and I rang around all of the other industry stakeholders and go, have you ever heard of this? And no one had ever heard of it before, and to my knowledge it's the first and only time that a vineyard worker's potentially contracted Q fever from overwintering sheep. Yeah, so it's something that we've now sort of thought about, and we've put some process and policies in place. So whilst we are just sheep, we don't actually even own sheep. Farmer brings his sheep into our properties all over the country. Now we put in processes where we don't handle the sheep. You know, if a lamb's stuck or whatever, then that's call the farmer and make that problem go away. Or if there's a fatality with a sheep or a lamb or something, that we get the farmer to come and handle that. A lot of farmers, and this is something that I've learnt through this process, they're vaccinated against Q fever because they're continually handling, whereas something that vineyard workers are not, routinely vaccinated against. And so it's something that as an industry we need to be aware of, alert of, maybe not alarmed about, but if your staff are handling sheep and physically handling sheep, then you probably want to talk to the...
Just sheep or other animals?
No, wild animals, sheep, cattle, goats, cats and dogs, or dogs can carry it as well, but it's pretty rare in that context. It's mostly abattoir workers that are routinely vaccinated against this. And
but more and more people are running sheep through vineyards over winter, so... Yeah,
which is why I've sort of, when we got the improvement notice, I sort of went to Sawyer and all the industry bodies and just said, hey, this has happened. I think as an industry we should be aware of it, so that
which is also it says a lot about the value of transparency and honesty. There might be some people that just want to go, okay, that might be bad for business if this gets out. Let's lock it down, keep it in house, sort it out ourselves. But by actually taking it out to industry, you can actually get an industry-wide solution.
Yeah, or just an awareness, Nick. Really, frankly, I'm a moderately intelligent bloke, but I wasn't aware of it. Yeah. And so I think, again, if we're aware of something, we can do our best we can to engineer against it. And I have no concerns about sitting here and chat about it or talking about it.
How sick did your staff member get?
It was interesting. The symptoms for Q fever are, how's this in the middle of a pandemic? They're respiratory symptoms, cough, cold, sort of flu-like symptoms with high fever. And so, when the individual was there, we just all assumed that it was COVID, and it wasn't. And I think they did a very good job picking that up and got, course of appropriate antibiotics and takes care of it. But interestingly, subsequently I've had conversations with a few other friends in ag and a few that have had it, and it really knocked them around. And, there's a small percentage that can have ongoing sort of lingering, impacts from it as well. So it's not something to be ignored or taken lightly. And it's it's interesting because I've always run sheep through our vineyards and never ever thought about it. And I've handled sheep and handled stuck lambs and things and never thought about it. I'm acutely conscious of it now.
Speaking of COVID, what's it been like managing that among so many staff?
Yeah, it's been. I think we've all been on that roller coaster and journey of unknown. Yeah, when it first started, that lockdown in the harvest period, that was like a B-grade Hollywood movie. Really, that was pretty intense, and we started to create cells within our staff and in different regions. And I asked a lot of my staff to sort of try to keep themselves as cocooned as possible so that we could just get the crop off, because that was critical for us. If we couldn't harvest our crop, I think we were very lucky to be allocated as an essential workforce, and that got us through the first sort of harvest period. Obviously, coming into the second harvest period, we had a bit more of an understanding and we had a bit more clarity and optics around that. But it was still probably one of the more challenging things we had to manage, in making sure that we keep people safe, and in the first instance, and follow my own rules in that context, and yet still operate the business and function. So I'm super lucky. We've got a great crew who understand. Many of us have been together for a long time, but understand the importance of the business and took on some, their own sort of personal sacrifices in cocooning down a bit during those periods. So, yeah, and then it's really best been following everything that the daily media reports said to do.
We've talked about isolated examples of queue fever and once-in-a-lifetime events like COVID, but sort of a day-to-day issue in what we do is we work in a business that produces alcohol, and are we doing enough to sort of talk about our relationship with alcohol and the way it exists in people's lives? But we know we love wine. It's the reason we do what we do, but it's not always the right thing for people. Do we need to be more open and honest about those discussions around alcohol?
Oh, I think so, Nick. I think I'm loving a whole lot of things we're doing with the no and low. I think that shows some of the things that we can innovate around some of the issues that you're talking about. It's imperative that we maintain a social licence to operate. Otherwise, let's face it, we grow a product that people don't have to have, and it's in a space where if we don't maintain a social licence to operate, then in the overall scheme of, water and resources and fuels and fertilisers and things, that they'll
go somewhere else.
Yeah, we need to do that. So I think it's about it's like the earlier conversation about some of the things that we talked about. We need to just keep having that conversation and be brave enough to have that conversation out loud, and all the opportunities that we have to make good decisions in that context for each of us. And particularly for us as leaders in the industry, how do we conduct ourselves at events? How do we responsibly interact with alcohol is important.
What limits do you put on yourself?
What limits?
Like during the week, drinking wise, or?
It depends on, I'm mostly a social drinker in the context of, if we're out with friends and family and things like that. But, if it's Friday night and I'm sitting down watching a movie with my wife, we'll open a nice bottle of wine and share that together. And it's interesting. I've got a 21-year-old son who's sort of...
No limits.
Well, no, it's interesting because he's actually really quite responsible and probably behaves a lot differently than I did when I was 21 as well. And I think I see that in his generation.
Well, they say they're drinking less than ever.
Yeah, and still, I've been really, really hot on never driving. I either drive or I drink. I don't do.
You have to drive a lot, so
it's something that I'm very comfortable. Driving to a function and sitting and not drinking, as opposed to sitting counting drinks and things like that. I think as an exec in the wine industry, I need to lead by example in that context, and that if I get picked up, God forbid, drink driving, that's not a good look. and it's not something that I want to have as part of my resume.
If you see someone who, you know, there's a few warning signs there, or you've got a bit of an inkling that they might have a bit of a problem with drinking, is that something that you would address with them, or how might you approach going about that? Because that's a pretty difficult thing to do.
If one of my staff members, doesn't matter whether it's alcohol, whether it's potentially a drug issue or any other health issue, then let's have a normalised conversation about that. I think it's, you know, we touched on before we sat down to record about, you know, Sammy D Foundation and some of the messaging they send around and the impact that that can have. And I think by normalising conversations just in our networks, in our you know, staff networks or in our sporting club networks, it makes it easier to manage some of those things. Because if it's just about, because it's not a taboo topic, because we just talk about it, then I think that's how we all make better steps moving forward.
I suppose it can be difficult to bring that up without that person feeling like that's an attack on them, or they're being accused of something and something that they should be ashamed of or embarrassed about that might lead to them losing their job or whatever it is. And if it's more normal discussion that's based on, I'm concerned about your health because I care about you first and foremost, then reframing it that way and having, I suppose, changing culture so that people aren't ashamed or really embarrassed about maybe drinking too much, that you can have that conversation and then it can actually get through without people just being defensive and closing it off and acting like, no, there's no need for them to review their behaviour or they don't have any issue whatsoever.
Yeah, again, it comes back down to that sort of standard we walk past, the standard we accept. And I think sometimes, you know, if I jump back in the time machine, one of the great things that, you know, having been in private practice where patients walk through your door, you shut the door and you have one-on-one conversations of, you know, that are under pure confidentiality circumstances, you get to understand. I don't find those conversations that difficult to have. I think they're really important conversations to have, and particularly with some of our workforce. They might be single guys or girls, or, you know, if you're not having them at work, they're not having them. So it's really, it's a great opportunity to have all of those conversations, and not just about, you know, alcohol, or it's about their own mental health. It's about, you know, it's about men's health checks or whatever that we talk about, you know, and laugh about going and getting your prostate checked or whatever it is, that it becomes normalised in that environment.
And I think when you talk about your 21-year-old son, I think that's a generation that's actually better at having those sort of conversations and being more, you know, aware of a whole suite of things. And then maybe it's up to the older generations to really lift their game and think about it a bit more.
Yeah, I think so.
How much do you think work health and safety is improving across the whole industry? Have you seen things change much? And
absolutely, I think there's a continuum though. I think we're all on a continuum. If you could go into certain sectors and certain farms, and the answer would be that we're back in 1950, and you can go into some organisations and you think, gee, I got to lift my game, because that is very impressive. And I think it's really important that we have that continuum, so you can always look across the fence to what next practice is and what's best practice. I think some of the big companies do that at an elite level. And again, I started by sort of saying, you know, we're great as an industry, helping each other out. I've many times go, have you got this form or a policy for this? Yep, bang, here it is. Just white out the you know, logo on the top and grab that. And I think that's something that, you know, more and more people should do, and people can ring me or email me and ask for a policy or procedure. I'm happy to hand that stuff out, because you sort of also don't know what you don't know. If you've grown up with mum and dad on a farm and you've always grown your property,
seen how it's been done, and you just assume that's how it's done.
Then you don't really know. So that's where some of Lease and Wine Grape Council and all the seminars and things that we go to are really important. Sawyer do a great job in that context as well. So there's sort of no excuse for not knowing, but it's, you know, we talked about finding the time to go to a doctor and get some vital checkups done. So finding the time to go to that seminar for you know injection of OH&S and work health and safety updates. is on the list, and it just needs to be, prioritised. I think that, I've spoken to some of the agri-chem suppliers about this at some of their management meetings. They've got a responsibility or an opportunity. When they're handing over a drum of something, that's an opportunity. That's an opportunity to check in and make sure the individual knows exactly what they've got. If you're not selling them a pair of gloves and overalls with it, then you've got to reflect and ask yourself, are you doing the right thing by that individual and that business? And so I guess it's the whole community of the industry looking at every opportunity that we can to make what we do safer.
As someone who's a leader in the industry, you must think a lot about where money gets injected into the industry and where money ends up being spent in this business. So, if we suddenly made you Australia's viticultural dictator and director and gave you, $100 million in R&D money to spend anywhere you thought was most useful across the whole national vineyard landscape, what would you be doing with it?
Recently, Nick, I chair the Australian Vineyards Committee, and I try to get experts in and give us a look at what's next. And we were sort of looking at some rootstock stuff, and one thing led to another, and we got Dr. Ian Dry in to present to us from CSIRO, and he explained to us what the Italians were doing with gene editing Prosecco. And I'm like, well, that's not going to be relevant to us because it's GMO and we're not doing that. And he goes, no, it's not GMO, it's gene editing, Ash. And I'm like,
yeah,
so it's not regulated.
Distinction?
And so this was probably one of the most profound things that I've learned in my 25 years, and I think could be potentially the biggest game-changing event from a grower's lot in life. But so gene editing uses a special technology called CRISPR-Cas9, which is it's effectively a gene surgical tool that you can go in on the existing DNA and say, okay, that gene we know makes the plant susceptible to powdery mildew. So if we go and just surgically chop that gene, that plant, same DNA, same Shiraz, same everything, is now not susceptible to powdery mildew. So this is going on. The Italians are working on it in Prosecco. The Americans are going flat out at it. And it's now the EU and the US FDA have said we're not regulating gene editing because it's not GMO. So there's no requirement for listing or labelling or anything like that. But you think about that from the context of a grower and you go, okay. And, we're still years away from that. But if the next time you roll your vineyard and you're planting a Shiraz vine, that doesn't have to be sprayed from a downy and powdery mildew point of view. We don't have to have conversations about the chemicals that we're using, the safety gear that we're going. It's game changing. And then if we think about the costs of that, it's enormous. So I think, like all of these things, the devil will be in the detail as to whether that immunity is, robust and lasting. But I would be spending a big whack of that money hunting that down, Nick, because I think the Australian wine industry grew up on an environment where we were maybe not encumbered by the sort of rigours of some of the, older established European regions, and that we were the innovators. Well, we're falling behind in that context. They're one of those sort of more traditional countries is going flat out, and so I think we need to be careful that we're not falling a few steps behind in that context. So yeah, that's where I'd be liking to see some of that go.
Well, yeah, it sounds like very profound change and money spent well.
3 quick questions to end on. Ash, who makes your favourite wine in SA?
I once did a absolute blind tasting of high-end Shirazes with a whole group of crew in brown paper bags, and Jim Barry's and Mark was standout for that, and it was, first time I sort of opened that up and said, you know what, I reckon that's pretty good value, even though it's a big price tag. That was pretty impressive wine.
Red or white?
Red.
And what makes the SA industry special in your eyes?
The collaboration, the fact that we can pick up the phone to pretty much anybody in the industry and we'll help each other out.
Nice and simple. Sweet.
Good, consistent answer. I think that's one thing we've heard across when asking everyone that question, and it's the same answer without hesitation or, having to second guess it. It just comes naturally that is the key thing that makes this industry special.
Even I've got mates that it should be our competitors, but, we know where the line is, and you're still going to be there to help out.
Good stuff, mate. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. Head to the Wine Grape Council of South Australia website for links and further resources. This is part of a bigger conversation, so feel free to share this podcast with your mates and look after yourselves. Cheers.